Let's take a minute and really drive home this idea of filter context by walking through a step-by-step measure calculation behind the scenes. So we're essentially going to replicate what Excel is doing instantaneously every time a measure gets calculated in a pivot table view. So consider something simple like this. We've got a total quantity measure broken down by store country as row labels. And if we isolate just the USA cell here, let's figure out how exactly this measure is calculated. And remember, we talked about how this kind of works, where we're looking at the coordinates, we're applying filter context. This is going to lay it out for you in a little bit more of a visual way, so hopefully it helps make it a little bit easier to grasp. So keep in mind, all of these steps happen instantly behind the scenes. You don't ever see it happen. Tables aren't actually getting filtered in view. It's all happening behind the scenes in memory. So we've got a three-step process here that happens every time a measure cell calculates. And step one, we've talked about, Excel detects the pivot coordinates and then applies the filter context. So this example, pretty simple. There's one coordinate and it's the store country column from the store lookup table equals USA. So given that coordinate, behind the scenes, Excel essentially applies that filter context to the store lookup table and filters down to only the rows where the store country equals USA. That's step one. Step two, those filters get carried downstream and applied to any related tables. So in this case, let's say in our data model, we've got two data tables, both downstream of and related to the store lookup table. Once that store lookup table is filtered down to only USA rows, that filter context flows or transmits through those relationship lines down to the downstream related tables. So as a result, both the returns and the transactions tables will filter down to USA rows as well. And then finally, step three, Excel evaluates the measure formula against those filtered tables. So here we've got a simple formula, the sum of the quantity column from the transactions table, which means Excel basically looks at this filtered version of the transactions table and it takes the sum of the quantity column and returns and displays the proper value, 555,899. Now the great thing is that understanding these steps is going to help us QA and troubleshoot issues if we don't see the results that we expect. This is a surefire way to trace back how a measure is being calculated and identify any issues that might be giving us incorrect or unexpected results. So what's kind of cool is we can actually replicate this physically just to really drive the point home. So let's go into Excel and actually do this, actually walk through each of these three steps manually. Okay, I'm back in my Food Mart data model. I've got the pivot kind of right where I left it. Got a filter for gender from the customer table. We're breaking down product brands as rows, and we've got store countries as columns. Now, just to simplify things a little bit, I'm going to pull gender out, just like a normal pivot. I can drag and drop anywhere in the field list, and it pulls it out of my filters box. And now let's identify a single cell here that we want to trace back. So let's go with Canada blue metal products. And I'm going to go ahead and just put a little highlighted fill on there so we remember which one we're dealing with. And this is the cell that I want to actually manually trace back through those steps to see how it's being evaluated. So step one, detect the pivot coordinates and apply the filter context. Well, our filter coordinates are store lookup, store country equals Canada, and product lookup, product brand equals blue metal. So we've got two coordinates. Now we need to actually apply those filters. And to do that, we're going to jump into our data model view. So we can go from Power Pivot into our data model. And we need to be in the data view where we can actually access our column headers and filter our data down. And what we can do is actually go into our store lookup tab, and we can replicate what Excel is kind of doing behind the scenes here, which is filtering down this lookup only to cases where the store country is equal to Canada. So as you can see, we're down to only two stores here. And then the second coordinate was that the product lookup product brand column is equal to blue metal. So we can go to our product lookup table, product brand, and expand this table, deselect, and just pull in blue metal and press OK. So step 1 is officially complete. We identified the pivot coordinates and we applied the filter context to those tables. Step 2, carry those filters downstream and apply them to all related tables. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So to take that step, we need to know which tables are related to our product and store lookups. So product lookup flows down to returns and it flows down to transactions. Store lookup flows down to transactions, flows down to returns. So we know that both of these data tables, transactions and returns, are both downstream and related to product lookup and store lookup. So both of these tables will get filtered accordingly. Now, for the sake of the example, since the measure only uses a field from the transactions table, let's start there and I'll show you what that looks like. So back in our data view, we now know that the store is filtered down to the 2 Canada stores, which have IDs 19 and 20. So if we go to our related transactions table, I can't see all that store information, but I do have the store ID because that's my foreign key here. So I can drill down, even though it's hidden from client tools, that's okay. And I'm going to just select stores 19 and 20, which I just showed were the 2 Canada stores. So now I've filtered this by store, and I also need to capture the filter from the product lookup. So just the blue metal brands have product IDs 80, 81, 77, 78, 79. And in fact, if we sort this ascending, you can see that it's a sequential list from 77 through 81. So back to transactions. Now we can filter down transactions based on product ID as well. And we can expand this out and scroll down until we get to 77, 78, 79, 80, and 81 and press OK. So we've officially completed step 2. Now keep in mind, we'd go through these exact same steps for the returns table as well. In fact, that is happening behind the scenes. But again, since our measure is related specifically to transactions, let's just focus on this one here. So we've officially completed step 2. We've transmitted or allowed those filters to flow downstream to the transactions table since it's related to both store lookup and product lookup. And now we have this filtered set of transaction data. Step 3, evaluate the measure formula against this filtered table. Okay, so we can access our measure right here in the calculation area, which shows that the measure is the sum of transactions quantity. Or we could jump back and manage our measures here to see how that measure is defined. But we know that it's the sum of the quantity column. So we go back to manage, and we can select that whole quantity column. Actually don't need to select the column. The measure shown in the calculation area here tells me that the total quantity for this filtered column, filtered table, is 171. And we jump back to the pivot, that's the 171 that gets returned right here. So that's what's happening behind the scenes every time you run one of these steps. And while we were able to do it in this case pretty easily because we're filtering down to a pretty small number of stores and products, this can get more and more complicated and a little bit more difficult to replicate when you're working with more complex scenarios. But regardless, knowing that that process is taking place is really helpful for troubleshooting. So let's go ahead and deselect that cell and watch what happens in the data model. I'm going to go data, manage data model. Watch what happens when I pull the store ID filter off. I clear that filter. You'll see my measure represented down in my calculation area has updated to 2520. And if I go back to my pivot and pull store country out, now the blue metal products equal 2520 because we are no longer filtered by country. And then following that logic again, if we pull product brand out, we see 833, 489. Jump back to the data model. unfilter on product, 833, 489. Now let me give you a really quick example of when this could be helpful to understand if things go wrong. So what if we pull in a field from our customer lookup, like the customer city, for instance? And as you can see, we're breaking down quantity just fine. And what if we wanted to pull in some data from that returns table? And I know I told you not to use implicit measures, but just for the sake of example, I'm going to pull it in. Two things happened here. One, we get this flag that tells me that relationships between tables may be needed. In other words, I'm trying to look at a data table with filter context from an unrelated table. And two, you'll see that I get the same exact total in every row in the pivot. And if we go through those steps to think about it, this row context is filtering the customer city, but then we get to step 2, which says apply those filters down to any related downstream tables. Remember that in our data model, looking at the diagram view, returns is not connected to the customer lookup table. Customer lookup is only connected to transactions, so there's no way for that filter that's been applied to the customer lookup to have any sort of impact on returns. And that's why Excel doesn't really know anything better than to just give you the grand total in every row. So again, that's why filter context is important. That's why having a really solid fundamental knowledge of it and understanding of it is so critical. And that's why it's helpful to really, really know and understand your data model before you start digging in and trying to explore things. So let's go ahead and pull that returns field back out. And now we're back in good shape. So hopefully that helps clear things up. If you still have questions about filter context, please don't hesitate to just post to the Q&A section, message me directly. I'd be happy to help out.